Hello again and welcome to another chess vlog. I wasn't initially planning on doing this, but I suppose if people take a liking to these videos, I might make this kind of video a regular thing. We'll see. Anyways, I've got a couple games to review, and I think this one is at least a little bit interesting. I'm black in this game, and to open us up here, we have the classic e4, e5, and then right off the bat, something a little bit odd, knight to h3. Yeah, normally you'd go to f3 to attack the undefended pawn, but I suppose if you're planning on following this up with knight to g5, then it doesn't really make much of a difference. Same result, which is actually what happened. After I played knight to f6, the opponent played knight to g5. Not really sure why the knight is jumping this deep into my side of the board that quickly, but whatever. I go bishop to c5, and then he plays queen to f3. Not really sure why he's bringing out the queen so early, or why he's putting the queen in a position where it can't really do a huge amount at this point in the game. You guys already know that I don't like bringing out the queen so quickly. Anyways, after I castle, he plays d4. I don't really know why, because the bishop is just going to take it and there's nothing defending the pawn, so unless you really need the bishop in that position, like maybe you'll attack it with something else, or maybe try to trade it later, I don't know. He then kicks the bishop. I guess this was his plan. He's opening up that side of the board by kicking the bishop and getting the pawns to move forward that way. So after I move the bishop back, he then moves to c4 with his pawn, which leaves the position the bishop was originally in completely undefended, so I can move back and threaten the rook. So what he does to defend is to move the knight forward. That's okay. That space is being defended by the queen. And then I move my queen forward to get it ready for an attack. It's attacking that hanging pawn. I don't know if that's the correct term, but this pawn is undefended. So I guess they call it hanging. I don't know. And then he decides to defend that pawn, but by moving the bishop there, the bishop is just not doing a whole lot in that position. The rook would have been fine. You make it impossible to castle on that side of the board, but you wouldn't want to castle on that side of the board anyways, because it's way open right now. So yes, moving the rook to b1 would have been better. You defend the pawn, and you get the rook started getting out there and into the field. So then I move this pawn, which this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. If I had moved the pawn to a5, then he cannot take my pawn, because then he would be opening the bishop to attack by the queen. But instead, I decide to play b6. I think I'm thinking that if he decides to go forward with this pawn, then there can be an exchange, but I don't really know why white would do that in this spot. Doesn't really need to. More likely, he would move this pawn forward, and creating a, well, that would leave the queen able to take the bishop without a fight, but these are moves to keep in mind for the future anyways. This move just isn't doing a whole lot, and I don't think it was a good move, and the bot agrees with me. So he castles on the queen side, which I just discussed is not really a good play, because the king is just open to attack in this part of the board. If you wanted to keep him safe, then you got to go on the king side, which is probably much, much better. But okay, I decide to move my bishop here. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense because I'm attacking this pawn, but again, a5, better move, and now I've just blocked a way better move for myself. And he moves the knight back. I'm not really sure why he's doing that. He could have moved to e2 as the bot is suggesting. That would attack the bishop. It would offer a trade of pieces, my bishop for his knight. And I would take that trade, by the way. Then I move my knight forward, which is also not really that good. There was a possibility of having the bishop go here in order to attack this diagonal here, because then I could take this pawn, and then the queen would have to do something. It can't retake the bishop because the knight is there. And this also was a mistake because it created this very easy fork, and it's also a discovered attack, so I'm either going to lose one of these pieces, and I can't take with the queen. I can't take this bishop now because the queen is now able to defend the bishop. So what I decide to do is I did plan on this possibility, but it's probably not a good play in general. What my plan was to first go here with the knight. I'm thinking that he's not going to take the knight with a bishop because then the queen just takes back and he doesn't really gain anything for it. I mean, he could still take the bishop with the pawn, but he decides to take the bishop with the pawn first, which is he probably should have done the trade first, but that's fine. Because what I decide to do next is I can take this pawn with check. The king moves out of the way for some reason, allowing me to check again. And the bishop, again, cannot take the knight because, well, it would be a trade if he took the knight, but he probably doesn't want to because that would put the queen in a better position for me. So the king just moves back. Okay. I mean, I could check the king again, but it's not really going to accomplish much. So what I instead decided to do, this was definitely a mistake. Putting the queen here is a very bad play. Because what happens is, it makes queen to b3 a very strong move for white right now. Because now you're defending this knight, you're actually attacking it. As now, if he decides to do the bishop trade in this position, I can't take back because the queen would just take my queen, and that would be a huge loss. So, he does not do that, however. He does not find that move. Instead, he goes bishop to d3, which is really bad because that strong move that I just talked about is now being blocked, so I'm even more safe. And I move this pawn forward. I'm hoping that he decides to capture with this pawn. Well, he can't capture with this pawn, actually, because it's actually pinned to the king. So I'm not sure why the bot is complaining. I could just take this pawn for free on the next turn and even kick the bishop, which would open the row for the queen, I suppose. So he decides to do the knight-bishop trade. He doesn't really gain much from it, unlike when the queen was actually available to move to b3. And then he plays this. Unfortunately, this was not the move you wanted to make because the queen recapturing here is actually a mate threat. Because my next move is to go to b2 with the queen, which is checkmate. What he should have done was, as this bot suggests, the only move he had was to go to e2 with a queen. In this position. So then after that, I suppose I could... What could I do here? I can't really do a whole lot, because both of the positions where the queen could check the king are defended by the knight. So in this spot, I suppose the game would go on. And I can't really say much more about this game, so let's move on to the next one. Alright, it's time for game 2 of this video, and I am playing white in this game. Now, what I think you're going to be interested when it comes to this game is the high number of moves that both players seem to miss. So there's going to be a lot of me being silly and still ending up winning somehow. So let's get into it. The opening is e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. I decide to not defend the pawn in the center and instead play bishop to c4, which is probably alright, but throwing away a pawn like that, not so great. So he decides to take the pawn, and I attack by putting the queen on e2 to attack the knight. Now, he could have defended with d5. It looks like you're throwing away a pawn, but you're really not, because if the bishop takes, then the queen is going to recapture, and if the queen takes the knight, of course, pawn captures the queen, obviously. So this move is doing two things at once, not only defending the knight, but attacking the bishop as well. But he does not do that. He instead plays this move, which is not really good, because I can take the pawn in the center with check, which is what happened. And he decides to block with the knight. Blocking with the queen would have been better because it not only attacks the queen, it also defends the knight. In fact, it pins my queen, which is really bad for me. So you should have done that in order to punish me, but he doesn't. So I play my pawn to d4 to open the way for the bishop and also defend the queen if an attacker happens to come around. And an attacker does come. Pawn to d6. So I gotta move the queen out of the way. Maybe could have moved it back further. The bot wants me to move it back further. But this position is fine too. Next up is a really unfortunate mistake. This is not something you want to do. The knight being there means that I can fork it by playing d5. And I did not take this fork at the time. My logic was, I don't need to get this knight out of the way because it's pinned anyways. So I don't really need to worry about this knight. But if he decided to, say, move the knight out of the way, then I could do... Well, that's probably not a good defense for that move, but I didn't play the fork anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I instead bishop to g5, attacking the queen, and also the bishop is defended by the knight, and he can't attack the bishop with his knight because it's pinned. But yeah, the bot is going to complain about me missing the fork, so that's my bad. He decides to defend the queen with his knight, and at this time I decide to trade my bishops for the knights, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, I like to do, even though it's not necessarily the best play. So that gets traded, and then next I play pawn to d5 to attack the bishop and hopefully kick it. And he decides to do that instead. Well, you're just throwing away the bishop by doing that, so I decided to take with the queen. And the queen is deep into the enemy side of the board now. Moves the rook, probably to stop me from doing a couple of weird things that I probably could do. Next, I move the knight here. The bishop is pinned to the king at this point, so no worries. The knight is not going to get captured. And he moves his rook forward to unpin the bishop? Well, he's attacking my queen, so I guess it's fine. I decide to attack the king with check. Rook has to come back. But capturing here is not a good play, because what he could do is, now that the bishop is no longer pinned, something that he could do is, well, first of all, taking the knight is free. That's the most immediate problem. I can't recapture with the queen at this point. So if he had done that, the game would have continued from there with me probably, well, the position would have been more or less even. At this point, I'm up a couple of pieces, but not by much. Then he moves his queen there, which removes the possibility of taking the knight for free, so we probably should have done that. That move doesn't really do a whole lot if you think about it. And then I decide to castle, again ignoring the problem of the knight being under attack by the bishop here. But it is pinned to the queen at this point. Although if he does decide to capture and I take the queen, it would be a trade. So he castles to make it not much of a trade. Then I move my knight to attack this rook here, and also prevent discovered attacks from the bishop deciding to move. But if I had moved it here on e6, you know, that position is defended by this pawn, so that probably would have been better. I would also fork the rooks, and that would have been really bad for him, but that's not what happened. He instead decides to try and kick the queen away. I decide to take another free pawn, but that's not a good position for the queen. There's probably some way he could really punish this, because I am in real danger here. Like, I'm trying to fight 4 pieces with 2. It's not really good. I should probably be getting my pieces out there, especially the knight on b1. I need to move that out of the way so that the rooks can see each other. So he decides to attack the knight by moving the rook, which is good. Then I move my knight. At this point, if he decides to capture my knight, I can take the rook that did it for free. So it's a bit of a standoff. Neither of us can really move without getting into more trouble. So that pawn move doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't really do a whole lot for him. And this rook move by me, it's attacking the bishop, but it's also ignoring that I could be moving my knight away to attack the rooks. But when you're on the clock, and all of these games, by the way, are played with 10 minutes of time apiece for each player, so I don't always notice the moves that I'm supposed to. He decides to play a checkmate threat, moving the queen all the way down there. And I respond with moving the pawn forward. This is a very easy checkmate threat to deal with. You just move your pawn on the G column forward 1 square, and everything's fine. I can get captured by that pawn, though, which is what he decides to do. And did I recapture? I don't remember. I did recapture. So there's no immediate threat of, like, instantly losing the game, because the pawn that the queen is looking at can still be defended by the pawn immediately behind it. And he decides to play a check. Yeah, I guess if you want the free move to get the queen out of danger, that's fine, but you weren't really in much danger to begin with. Then he decides to... I think he made a mistake here. Well, no, actually, this rook is being defended by the queen at this point, so that was probably the idea behind playing that check. So that's totally fine. But it leaves me open to play a check here against the king. Moves his king. That's the only move he has, by the way. And then next, I take the bishop, because it's now free. With the king away from the bishop, I can take it for free. And that's not the move you wanted to make. There is actually a really, really great move in this position that I could make. If I'd found this move in the game, which I didn't, I would have felt just plain invincible because it's a really great move. So if you want to like pause the video for a couple seconds and see if you can find the move I'm talking about, I'll let you do that. And in 3, 2, 1, I will reveal the move. 1, 2, 3. Knight takes d6 is the move I'm talking about. And immediately you're probably thinking, oh, this just gives up the queen for no reason, right? Well, this was actually a mate threat because if the rook goes to e8, then it's game over. The only square that avoids the rook is under attack by the knight. So it's game over in that spot. And if he instead decided to capture the knight, then the queen just goes to f8, and it's game over again. I guess the little icon just isn't showing up on the site, but whatever. So yes, the move he wanted to make was a6, because that gives the king an escape route, essentially. But he doesn't do that, and I don't find that really good play. I instead just attack the queen, and the bot wonders, what are you doing? You're ignoring the instant win. And then he decides to capture my knight with the rook. I recapture. He recaptures again. And then I recapture again. And I could have traded queens because that spot was under attack by the queen. I suppose at some point I could have just taken the queen instead of taking all these rooks. But then again, my queen was under constant attack and I wanted to keep mine. So I thought that was more important than taking his queen. And then that... Oh yeah, he made a mistake. He thought capturing that pawn was free. It was not. And at this point, you know, it was basically over for him. I think he just threw away all of his pieces out of frustration. So at this point, there's not really anything he can do, and it eventually resulted in a checkmate. Would have felt really great to get the checkmate far earlier, but that did not happen. It doesn't always work out that way. And as they say, if you see mate, look for better. Now I'm just stealing lines from that other chess channel. And also at this point in the game, I was running low on time. I only had about 90 seconds left when I made this final move. So I was a little worried that I would run short on time and I needed to hurry myself up a little bit. So I wasn't thinking completely clearly. And now for the third and final game of this video, I'll be playing white again. And we have another Scandinavian defense game. Not my favorite opening in the world, for black anyways. But it resulted in an interesting position this time, so let's get into it. The opening is the same as it's always been. e4, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, and then knight to c3 attacking the queen. Queen has to move, and this player decides to bring it back to its original position, which is apparently a book move. I don't know who wrote that book. Seems silly to bring the queen out only to put it back in its original position. I mean, the only difference is you're down a pawn. Or rather, there was a pawn trade. So I move my knight forward, he develops his knight, I decide to pin his knight to the king, and he moves his pawn forward to open the way for the bishop. And I do the same. And then knight goes to e7. If this looks weird at all, he's actually defending his other knight from being taken by my bishop. And you might be thinking, well, he's got a pawn defending that knight anyways, right? Well, if he takes with a pawn, then that's going to result in a worse pawn structure. So he doesn't want that. That's why he put the knight there. I move my bishop forward to pin that knight to the queen, and he unpins by kicking the bishop. I move my bishop back, and then he tries to kick my bishop, and when my bishop gets kicked, I usually trade it for the knight, which is what happened here. And as I said, he moved that knight into that position precisely so that he could avoid ruining his pawn structure by taking with the pawn. So then, I decide to castle. He then kicks my bishop again. I'm okay with that. I need to get it into a better position. Then he plays h5. I don't know what's up with that move, but okay. If the bot thinks it's fine, then it's probably fine. And then I move my queen forward. I must be ignoring something that I could do here. But I put it in that position so that it's able to attack those diagonal lanes where the bishop and knight are. But okay, bot doesn't think that's doing much in one move. I'll agree with that. Then he moves his pawn forward here. This is a good move because that pawn is being defended by the pawn right behind it. I can't take it. Then I decide to move my rook to attack the file that the king is on. Or is that a rank? I'll get my chess terminology sorted out later. He decides to kick my knight, and I can't really see any position that I can put the knight in where it won't be captured, so I decided to throw it into the position where I thought that it could do the most damage if he decided to take. And that was this position, which it was a mistake. I thought that he would take with the pawn, which would enable me to create a discovered check, but the other knight is there, so he winds up taking with that instead. And I do take with the bishop, and the pawn there is at least pinned, so he can't take with that, but he can take with the queen, so I'm down a bishop, which is unfortunate. Well, actually, I've lost both my bishops, and he hasn't lost his, but I've lost one of my knights as well. So I decide to kick the queen. Queen goes back. Then I decide to attack the queen again. This is the thing about bringing your queen out like this. You wind up having to move it around a bunch. So in this position, what did I do here? I'm trying to imagine what I would do. Oh. I must be ignoring some other move that I could have made. Let's see here. Let's see what the bot says I should do here. It wants me to do... It's looking at c4 for some reason to defend the knight from being taken. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I could have defended the knight like this. It's good to have the bot suggesting moves in the middle of my review so that I don't have to pretend like I found all the moves. But instead, what happened in the actual game was I played knight to b4. Which is basically going right back to where I was. Queen decides to attack by going to b6. And then I decide to attack the queen again. Yeah, this resulted in an almost loop of sorts, but I could have done a bunch of other stuff instead of trying to loop him. I guess I was looking for maybe getting a draw with the repetition rule, but that's a silly thing to do. You should never do that. So what eventually happened was I attacked the queen again. He goes back. This must be riveting, I'm sure. I move this pawn forward thinking that if the pawn takes, I can again get a free move by giving check. He decides to attack the knight for some reason. Yeah, moving the bishop forward to attack the rook would have been better because the rook doesn't have anything defending it right now. So, I move the knight back to get away from the pawn. And he attacks the rook with his pawn, which is... Why aren't you doing it with the bishop? You could have also kicked my knight again. So my rook goes one space forward, which is... Yeah, that's probably not the best play, but at least there the rook has defenders. Actually, yeah, the bot says that if I had taken the pawn here, then that pawn would have been defended by the knight, and yeah, I would have gotten a free move out of it, I guess. But by playing that, he's allowed to take my pawn for free, which he did. And I'll take his pawn for free, so it's basically an even trade. And he can't go to b2. This is a common sort of attack that you get. The queen coming down here to one of the pawns on either the b file or the g file. But here I'm defending that from happening, so no free pawn for you. But he's instead going to attack the bishop, with the bishop, excuse me. And then I decide to take another free pawn. Could have also done it with the queen, which probably would have been better. That would get the queen into a better position, because this position that you see right here is going to be very interesting in a couple of minutes. So he moves his bishop there. Bot says that's a good move, but you're not really doing a whole lot besides getting the bishop like one square forward, so don't look at me for the answer to that. I think he's going for like some kind of weird attack on the back row, so I decide to move my pawn to a3. Bishop can't take it. He castles, which is good. The king needed to get into the corner that's more defensible. I move my queen to, basically to get into the enemy territory. There's no immediate threat there. And then he moves his pawn forward here. He needed to defend that area a little more, I think, because well, this is a mistake, actually, because in this position, like, he can make a couple trades and make some really weird threats. Well, actually, really good threats. Because if the bishop takes the knight here, it actually creates this discovered attack on the rook. And he's also attacking the rook down here. So it's basically a fork. It's like a discovered fork. And if I try to take the bishop, then the rook is going to attack here and take my rook. So that would have been a really good move for him to play, but he doesn't play it. He instead throws away his bishop, because by moving this pawn forward, you've enabled the queen to attack the bishop, and he resigned in this state. I guess he was frustrated at throwing away a piece like that, but the game could have continued, and I think he would have had an okay chance of maybe me making another mistake. But in this position, the move that I talked about just now is not as good, because if you take with the bishop here, and then I take with the rook here, then you have to take the rook back. So you can't take this rook down here. Instead, you have to take back. Otherwise, I'll show you briefly what happens. It's not instantly checkmate, but there is like only 3 moves left. Like he's 3 moves away from checkmate. So he has to take back the rook, and then I can take his bishop, and then I'm basically safe. I've got a rook and a queen going against a rook and a queen, and I've got more pawns, so that's probably why he resigned. So that's the end of this video for now, and maybe there'll be more chess reviews in the future. These are all games that I play on chess.com, and if I find an interesting one, I'll review it on YouTube again. So see you later, everyone.